coronavirus in college sports, the future of football, and conference crossovers? We'll talk about all of that and plenty more with UTEP Director of Athletics Jim Center. I'm Duke Keith, and this is El Paso Townsquare. Welcome everybody to El Paso Townsquare. Duke Keith with you, and very pleased to be joined by UTEP Director of Athletics Jim Center. And Jim, thank you very much for being with us today, as once again, there is a lot to discuss when it comes to COVID-19 and how it affects the Sun City and affects all the Sun City institutions. Certainly UTEP is one of those. Talk to us about how you guys are bearing up, and you personally, as once again, it's something that's affected the whole area. UTEP is no exception.
Yeah, you bet, Duke. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the air with you, and appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to be on KLAQ and spending time with you all. You know, this issue with COVID-19 and where our country's at, it's unprecedented, and I think everybody realizes and sees this. It's really a unique time in our nation's history for every single one of us as private citizens. So I think we're all just trying to figure it out. And it seems like every day I get more questions about things and where we go from here and what do we do. And my standard answer is it depends. It just depends on what the heck happens, right? But on a personal note, I can tell you my wife and I and our daughter, who was finishing up her junior year in high school, managed to get through our shelter-in-place order at home and shared the house all together. In good. Our senior staff, or I should say our executive team here at UTEP Athletics, has now been back in the office. This is our third week that we've been back, and we're trying to help the university prepare for the reintegration of staff and faculty on campus and coming up with a plan and kind of being the guinea pigs, if you will, for a return to work on campus.
Yeah, I think guinea pigs might be a good word for it, because obviously you guys kind of have to get to work before the rest of the university does. Is that the way UTEP is kind of looking at this?
That's exactly right. And we know, obviously, we don't know exactly what the fall is going to look like for students' return to campus, but we do know that this summer in summer school will all be delivered online with online learning. But we know this, for us to have an athletic program and to have a fall sports, competitions, we're going to have to bring our student athletes back this summer. They're actually going to physically have to be on campus to train. They're going to have to be able to get coached. And as we head into typically what we call the preseason for the fall, which is that first week in August, typically, we've got to be ready to go. We've got to be able to train our student athletes and our coaches and staff on protocols and procedures. We've got to be able to make sure that the operations follow the best practices. But we've got to be able to make sure that we've disciplined ourselves to do the right things as it relates to opening back up, to try to mitigate the risk, and most importantly of all is keep our student athletes and our coaches and staff safe.
I know that safety's got to be the biggest issue, and it is for everybody, but I mean, how do you ensure that? Are there guidelines coming from the state of Texas, from the University of Texas system? How are you preparing to try and keep people safe, and if you could kind of fill us in on some of the details,
you bet.
At least the start of this.
You bet. Well, excellent question, and I think there is so much information out there. The question is who you're listening to. We continue to keep reverting back to CDC guidelines. That's the national governing body that, in theory, should be disseminating best practices and what that looks like. So we continue to refer back to CDC guidelines, and there's a lot of folks that weigh in on what can be done and what will be allowed to be done from the president to the governor to the system to UTEP. But we're really relying on CDC best practices. So what does some of that look like? Well, right now, when I come to work in the morning, we take everyone's temperature as an example. If anybody were to have a temperature that's beyond 100.4, they wouldn't be allowed to come in. That's one thing. Everybody has to wear their PPE, their face mask, right? So when I get out of my car, this is what's on my face right there, right? And if I'm in my office, I take it off. But when I leave my office and I go out into a common area, the coffee room, the restroom, the reception area. That's got to be on. And I'll tell you, dude, it's hard because you're so used to just getting up and running out there and doing something and going to somebody's office. Trying to discipline yourself to employ the best practices, right, in what we're going to consider a policy and a mandate. It's hard to do. Social distancing. When we go to our conference room, we've had to measure it out and make sure our conference room can handle no more than 5 people. When we have our senior staff meetings, we could have 15 people in there. Employing 6-foot social distancing best practices. So these are the kinds of things that, number one, we have to train people. We have to make sure that they're prepared. Number 3, we have to make sure that they maintain that discipline so that we can protect everybody.
Well, it's a good thing maybe that you have like the Don Haskins Center or the Sun Bowl. Seems like social distancing could be a little easier if you wanted to use those areas for conferences.
Yeah, absolutely. They are. And certainly, we're looking at the return to play voluntary workouts protocol for student athletes. So you can imagine if you take 25 football players and you want to work them on Glory Field, you need to give them the social distancing space that they need. When you take them off of Glory Field and go into the weight room right now in LKD, all of a sudden that becomes much more problematic, right? Because frankly, we can only handle 18 student athletes in LKD at a time because we have 18 platforms and 18 stations where they would all work out without them having to rotate around the facility. And so if you're at your platform and you have all the weights that you need and I'm at mine, so then the question is, when you're in there, do you have to wear a face mask? We're requiring that they wear a face mask doing their indoor workouts, right? So think about this. I mean, if you're lifting heavy and you're doing intense workouts in there, your exhalation will tend to be much more forced than just normal breathing, right? So that's why having that face mask is really important because it keeps, if you're asymptomatic, but that doesn't mean that you don't have the virus. You could have it, but you're asymptomatic. 3 days from now, you're symptomatic. In 5 days from now, you test positive when somebody gets a test on you. There's no way we can reduce all the risk, but we're trying to mitigate the risk to the best of our ability.
I think that's probably the biggest thing is especially in weight rooms and common areas where everybody's used to being together. And then you add the 85 to 100 kids that are always there for any kind of a football practice. That's just got to be the biggest issue and probably your largest worry. I mean, how do you wipe down equipment between workouts and how thorough do you have to be? Is there a guideline for that? Just so many I's to dot and T's to cross.
Yes, that's exactly right. And for most everybody that they've lifted weights before, and particularly when you think about free weights, but if we were doing some type of circuit in training, where I did squats, this set, and then I go to the next station and then you come to squats. Well, think about how complex that is because I touch that bar, my back, my shoulders, my neck, my sweat, my hands come right behind me. So we'd have to wipe all that down in between the rotation. Well, so instead we've decided we're going to leave you at the same place and you're going to do all your workout and touch just that stuff. And when we get done with that section of weights, then it'll be the student athlete's responsibility. We'll provide them the sanitation and the wipes and the spray to wipe everything down, all the free weights that they touched, right? The bench, the bar, everything, the collars, we'll have to do that. And then after they exit the weight room, if lunch comes in, they'll have to be sanitized. But that doesn't mean that potentially droplets couldn't be floating around in the air, right, from somebody's breathing or sneeze or cough. And that's why this is so risky.
And that's, honestly, that's kind of the biggest issue when you talk about risk. There's just no way, especially with something like football, with so many athletes. Obviously, for tennis or for golf or for an individual sport, it's got to be a little bit easier. But any kind of team sport, obviously, you don't know yet what you're going to do, how it's going to work. But I imagine you guys are very busy trying to come up with the best practices. And I would imagine you're on the phone with a lot of other directors of athletics around the country.
We are, Duke, and I've had probably about 10 hours a week on Zoom calls and those kinds of activities with other athletic directors, Conference USA and otherwise. And everybody's sharing what they're doing, why they're doing it, some of the things that And so everybody's looking for some commonality. It wouldn't surprise me for the NCAA to come out with some common standards at a minimum for schools to have to adhere to. So in other words, if I'm coming to your school to come play on this coming Saturday, or you're coming to my school, what are the things that you and I as athletic directors and as head coaches would agree that we've both done to keep our kids safe, number one, and our staff safe, number two? But then how do I keep your staff and your kids safe, right? Because let's just say that the common standard is every Friday, all the athletes will be tested, and you'll know before the game on Saturday, everybody that's playing the game that Saturday has been positive. And if they are, what will happen? In other words, will the game be called? Will all the athletes that have been exposed to that individual be quarantined at that point in time? So you can see how challenging it might be. I could travel to your place and we could be sitting there, and all of a sudden at 9 o'clock at night, we get our test results and we go, doggone it, the quarterback tested positive. We had no idea. He's had a great week of practice. You go, well, the quarterback has been in the offensive meeting room and around the entire team, on the plane, on the bus, in the hotel. So we have to call the game because we've agreed that you and I aren't going to put any athletes at risk and jeopardy. We have a contact sport. There's no way that my guys can be touching your guys without potentially sharing the virus if they had it. That's how complex this stuff is to get done.
It's incredibly difficult to maneuver around, and I would imagine that there are you guys talking about, and we'll get into the particulars of where UTEP might be going, because there's some interesting news between Conference USA and the Sun Belt, and I know that nothing is resolved yet, but have you guys thought about maybe starting later in the year? I mean, how are you going to play home games? Are you going to socially distance in a stadium? I imagine the Sun Bowl might be a little easier to pull something like that off, but have you thought about perhaps starting later in the year, say October and November, with a sport like football?
That's probably one of the biggest I think questions that's out there nationally. I'm not sure who the ultimate decision maker will be for that. If that will come from the NCAA, will the buck be passed to the conferences? So in other words, and we've had this discussion in conference meetings, how many schools would have to be ready to play on any given Saturday for us to carry out our schedule? Is it 51%? Is it 75%? Is it 12 out of 14? 14 have to be ready to go, so we have a full schedule. If that is yet to be determined, my personal philosophy is I think if the majority, so 7 or 8 schools, are prepared to play and can play, that they should. If my school's not ready to play, then they can't, right? But I don't think we should keep FAU and FIU from playing one another, or WKU and Marshall from playing one another, just because we're not ready to go, right? Because every community is going to be different with community spread in positive cases and where they're trending, right? So then your question about, well, do we put it back? I think that will come from a higher authority, and they're looking at things like that. Some people have talked about maybe you just don't play the 4 non-conference games that you have. And what if everybody started October 1? What about if we were to play the 12 games, but basically instead of starting with your opener, whatever your opening date was, and you start on that first weekend in October, right? And then it bleeds into the month of December, right? So that's a concept. So some people have said, well, maybe we play the non-conference schedule and we only play the conference schedule, right? So we are looking at what are the ramifications of each and every one of those kinds of decisions. None of them are good, I can tell you that, right? It may allow you to get through the season or buy you some time for the virus to either go away, or for medicine, science to catch up and come up with a vaccination and those kinds of things.
Well, let me ask about that in particular. As you get to the point where you start making decisions, and I'm going to kind of put you on the spot and ask you a little bit about, what's kind of an absolute deadline for you guys. Obviously for UTEP, it's got to go by conferences, but just to kind of go a little more into getting ready to play, and say there is that majority of teams that are ready to go. But what if you say, 5 guys suddenly test positive the night before the game, that scenario you were playing out before. Do you skip it? Do you change that with another team? How is that going to work, especially for something as unwieldy as football?
Yeah. You know what, Duke? I don't have the answer for you. It's unprecedented, and no one knows how this will really play out. I think it'll first of all revert back to what is the common standard of care that we've all agreed that we're going to do to protect our student athletes and staff, and you do the same thing with yours, right? And so if someone is tested positive on my team, and if the standard of care is that we will not expose the other team to anybody that has come in contact with somebody that's tested positive, then we'll have to call the game. And the game will not be played. And that could come from your team. It could come from my team. Who the and then the next thing is, if we know the incubation period potentially in the symptoms would show up over the next 14 days, let's just say today is Thursday, and we determine we have 1, 2, 5. It doesn't matter how many you got, but we have positive tests on our team. We put them into 14-day quarantine. Okay. Well, then that means not only do we miss the game this Saturday, but we miss the next Saturday, right? Because somebody 10 days from now could all of a sudden be positive.
Yeah.
And we're probably looking at missing 2 weeks at a minimum before we could be in the queue to play the third game. And hopefully you're healthy again.
And that's got to be the hardest issue, just to try and sort these things out. Obviously, with smaller team sports, when you've got 13 to 15 guys in a basketball team, or ladies as the case may be, it's a little easier to wrangle. And obviously, games can be a little more interchangeable. Nothing's absolutely played on a Saturday. And I imagine that might be another thing for you guys to take into consideration is, maybe you just delay it a couple of days and work something out to where teams are ready to go. And I imagine there's just going to have to be a lot more flexibility when it comes to scheduling these things just to get through, especially football. I keep bringing it back, but football's the biggest issue, isn't it?
It is. Well, because it has the most people,
Yeah.
and it takes so many people to put on a game, right? So, you use the word flexibility. I try to describe it like this. It's a very fluid situation that causes us, using all the sports metaphor, we've got to be ready to shift, be nimble, be agile, pivot in a different direction as quickly as we can. And those people who can do those kinds of things, that their organizations are built and they have that mindset, will probably get more games in than those people aren't. And that's going to mean, thinking outside the box, maybe taking a little bit more risk and being comfortable with the risk associated with doing something different. It's going to be a really unique time, and it's going to be interesting to see how different people maneuver through this space.
I think when you talk about, especially you talk about college athletics and it's not professional athletics. None of these guys are getting paid. None of these ladies are getting paid to go play their sport. That's the other thing. You're taking care of a bunch of kids. You're taking care of 300 different sets of parents and their children just to try and maneuver the health and safety issues. That is also, I would imagine, something you think about all the time.
Yes, we do think about that. And as we prepare for our student athletes to come back on campus to have voluntary workouts, right? One of the things we're going to do is we're going to be holding a Zoom call with all the student athletes who want to come back on campus, to have those voluntary workouts, but we're also going to invite their parents. We need to let their parents understand if they want to ask us questions about what are we doing to try to protect their children, what kind of safety things do we have in place, what are the expectations? We've got to try to help massage those fears and concerns moms and dads will have on behalf of their children. Because as you and I both know, many young people will be like, I've got a big S on my chest. Nothing's ever right. And the truth is they're vulnerable too. Now they're probably in better shape than most human beings with less underlying conditions. But the truth is they could get the virus and get sick just like anybody else. So we're doing the very best job we can of explaining to mom and dad, yes, we're aware of the environment. Yes, we're going to do the best job we can to mitigate the risk. Here's one of the things that we can't control. When student athletes or when people come to our campus, we can do all the right things from mask to temperature to social distancing, but that doesn't mean we can control what young people or faculty and staff do when they leave our campus. They can be going to parties at night. They can be having graduation, galas with having people over their house. They can be going to their churches and mosques. We can't control any of it. So that doesn't mean that isn't going to happen here. It just means, have we done everything we can within our power when they're within our care during the time?
Absolutely. And what you talk about, I guess, the kind of deadlines that you guys are coming up with, because I imagine you're in discussion, as you say, all the time with everybody from all the different conferences. When are you going to have to start making those hard decisions? As my old boss, Eddie Mullins, would say, his colloquialism was not cutting time growing up on a ranch. What is that date for UTEP and for Conference USA?
Well, we don't have a hard deadline right now. What I can tell you is I think most people in our industry right now are thinking that the middle of July is kind of going to be that window where you have to say, yes, we're going forward with it would be the first decision, right? So the bottom line is you got to have training camp. We're not going to bring all these kids back in a mandatory fashion in a high density environment and have training camp. Right now, we're having to make some of the tough decisions. We're trying to look at, can we bring kids back for voluntary workouts maybe June 8th and take our first baby step there with maybe 25 or so. And then on June, I think it's what is that, 7 days later, June the 15th, open it up and then maybe being at 50 to 75 student athletes, right? So we're having to make tough decisions right now. And our campus has got to be comfortable with those decisions we go forward. But I think somewhere around the second or third week in July is probably the drop dead date of fall training camp, unless you push the season.
And let me ask about some of the rumors I've been hearing about Conference USA working together with the Sun Belt Conference. I would imagine that this has something to do with what you talked about earlier, being fluid, being ready to pivot at a moment's notice. Can you tell us anything further about that and what that might entail, especially for football, but also as you kind of get into some of the late autumn and winter sports like basketball? You bet.
The obviously conference alignment is always one of everybody's fun topics to throw out there, and the banter is nonstop. I can tell you, we've been having discussions with let's just start with Conference USA. Our conference commissioner stood up a group called the Futures Planning Committee, and we've been studying for the last 8 weeks on what are the different models, from scheduling, roster sizes to travel party size, championship formats. We've looked at everything we possibly can look at as a way to become more efficient, more effective, and make our league better. And we presented a group of proposals to all the other athletic directors. Directors have all voted on they think should go forward. Those will be going to the CEOs this week, I believe. And we'll see if there aren't some unique and creative things that we do there to try to mitigate costs. Our conference commissioner's done a great job already in cutting costs at the conference level to be able to reduce fees and push money back to the schools. But with that, it's inevitable that you're going to have discussions about how do we schedule more games that are closer to home and where there's more alignment to play in increased fan interest in regional games. So that has caused everybody to look at where everybody else at, and could we do things like a scheduling alliance with let's say the Mountain West, or could we do it with the AAC? Do it with the Sun Belt Conference, which is kind of overlaying. We're so interconnected there across the Southeast region. So there's some discussion about that and what it might look like, but nothing has been formalized, and I'm not familiar with any formal discussions on any type of merger or anything like that. I don't believe that's in the works, but I think it's causing people to open up the dialogue and say, what if? Does it make sense for us to look at things like that? So we'll see. I would imagine geography has got to be a big deal when you start talking about conferences and where everybody can go. What are the travel costs involved? Any kind of sport. But I mean, I know we keep coming back to football. I keep saying football, but it is the 800-pound gorilla in college athletics. And geographically speaking, Conference USA and the Sun Belt do make sense together, don't they? They do, because we're over the top of them and they're over the top of us. We're all interdispersed amongst the same general geographic region. And that's why a lot of people keep asking the question, why not? And what would it take to do it? At UTEP, we're an outlier because we're on the far outside edge of everything. Okay. And even if there was something, I mean, let's say another conference or a Sunbelt school like Texas State, as an example. I mean, let's face it, we're not busing to San Marcos. Everything we do with Dallas, San Antonio, San Marcos, you go to Houston, it's a plane flight because you're not going to put kids on buses for 8 hours. So we're an outlier in this, and that's one of the challenges that we have in particular. And even if, the old Mountain West days, or excuse me, the old WAC days when we were part of the WAC, which was now the Mountain West, with the exception of New Mexico, everything else was a plane flight there too.
Sure. Absolutely.
So,
being on the Rocky Mountains is, it's a little tough. We are far removed from anybody. And I used to love to listen to, bands. We'd go to South by Southwest every once in a while, and bands say, oh yeah, we'll just drop by El Paso. Okay. You're ready to take a 9-hour drive up I-10. You're good. But
you're exactly right.
Tell you what, let me ask you about, in terms of, okay, we've talked about conference alignment. We've talked about football a lot, but as you guys kind of wrangle everything, it's a lot more than that. As we mentioned, it's over 300 student athletes participating in a wide range of sports, men's and women's. And logistically speaking, I imagine that especially you and some of the folks in the upper echelons of the athletic department are really kind of earning your keep right now. I mean, people talk about athletic directors and all. It's got to be a fun and wonderful job. You're showing up. You got a box all to yourself in a press box. This is the time where you guys are earning your keep, isn't it?
It's been really interesting. And obviously, everybody's learning. It is I think stoked the creative juices in everybody because we're having to be more creative in a lot of ways. And yet there's a fair amount of stress thinking about the what ifs and the preparation for making some really tough decisions, whether it's budget, sports, all those kinds of things. And we're having to go through some of those munitions as well. So, all in all, it's great to work with young people. It's great to represent UTEP in this university. And I know this too shall pass. We'll get through it. But in the meantime, right now, we're having to tighten our belt, just like everybody in the country. There's a lot of unknowns moving forward. But we'll get through this, and eventually we'll come out on the other side, and we're going to have learned and grown from it. Hopefully our student athletes will have learned and grown that everything's not a given, and playing sports is a blessing, and it's not a God-given right. It really is something they should be very, very grateful for because it could be taken away, and they could lose it, right?
Yeah. I think when you talk about budget, you mentioned that's got to be the hardest thing of all because money's a finite resource, and especially at UTEP, I know this more than somebody say from a Power 5 conference. You've got to really allocate everything very well, and the chances are you might not have the income from gate receipts and things like that to really continue going. Can you talk about the money issues and how the university, because I know the university kind of helps in the athletic department, how things are going to be funded and what are some of the solutions you're trying to come up with in regards to just, keep the money flowing at UTEP Athletics?
Well, I can tell you, Duke, in a lot of ways, we're a lot better off than a lot of my colleagues because we don't have this dedicated student athletic fee, which many universities do. And so that is directly tied to, number one, students being on campus, and number two, student enrollment, right? So while we're prepared and we've gone through an exercise with every single head coach and budget administrator, what if we had to make a 5% cut, a 10% cut, or a 15% cut? What would, I'm asking you, coach, you prioritize what's the most important thing to spend money on. And so we've gone through that exercise. And so we're prepared to do that if we have to. We haven't gone as far as saying, what if there was no football season, right? Because that's a catastrophic type of event and would be changing. That would have a significant ripple effect all over America if that doesn't happen. And so we're working through that. Some of the areas that the university can help us, come from funding through auxiliaries. As an example, when Jorge Vasquez, who runs our special events on campus, holds events in the Don Haskins Center or has a concert in the Sun Bowl, some of that money may come to athletics because they can allocate it from there. But if they're not having them, then there's no money to be dispersed, right?
Yeah.
So the ripple effect, all this. If we get money from concessions and there's no events happening, and your concessions revenue goes down. So there's not a lot of other answers in terms of where you're going to go get revenue. You're going to have to make difficult decisions with regards to expenses and cutting expenses.
Well, I appreciate you spending so much time with us, and I'm happy to hear that it's not as bad perhaps as it might be in other places. And you're correct. You're correct. This too shall pass. We do know that UTEP Athletics will be there for the folks of El Paso. Whether or not they might be able to attend games at the very first of it, it's going to be there. And I know you've signed a new television partnership, and things are going to be better at some point. We certainly appreciate you spending so much time, and hope all the best for you and UTEP Athletics both.
Thank you, Duke. I appreciate it very much. We appreciate you all. Hope you and your family are staying safe and healthy, and we'll look forward to the fall here as we get underway soon.
Our thanks to UTEP Director of Athletics Jim Center for his time and for helping to kind of center us, so to speak. One of the more relentlessly positive people you will find in all of the Sun City, and he just has that effect on people. The sun will come out, as we do know in El Paso. Lots of questions as to where and when and how, but it will come out. And we certainly hope for Jim's sake, for his administrators, for his coaches, and especially for his players, that they get to strut their stuff in front of the Sun City. Any return to normalcy in El Paso, Texas, means UTEP Athletics. And we hope they get to do their thing for us soon enough. I'm Duke Keith. Our thanks to you for watching today. This is El Paso Townsquare. Until next week, so long, everybody.